very happy to be here. Thank you to all of you for making time to get out here. I was kind of doing as you were going, and thank you for your introductions too. Kind of doing some mental arithmetic to add up the years of technical experience. I said, it's been great to meet you. Because it's pretty overwhelming to have a collection of folks like yourselves here. So thanks very much for coming out. This is me. I'm a seismologist. My job title is geophysicist, but I'm trained as a seismologist. Been at the Volcano Observatory and for a number of years. And as you might have caught the news, we keep putting it out there too that yes, Mauna Loa is an active volcano, and yes, Mauna Loa has been showing some signs of increased activity, and then I will admit to joining the rest of you and scratching my head in terms of what it really means. But at the same time, I'm paid by you folks to actually work a little harder trying to understand what these things mean. And so I wanted to share a little bit about some of our experiences with Mauna Loa eruptions, and pretty specifically through the seismological lens, the viewing lens. Let's see what and then with the collection of, I didn't necessarily have a sense of who all might be here, but with knowing that this was the Tech Pauhana, I think I was able to set up my talk so that what I like about being a seismologist is sort of being somewhat aware of the evolution of the technologies that we've used and that we've exploited in order to try to take the science that we got all of our book learning with and trying to apply it into not only understanding the Earth, but also applying that understanding to natural hazards and being able to kind of understand how we might best deal with the natural hazards. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the technical evolution of our seismic monitoring, and then of course to then speak about the state of Mauna Loa activity such as we might want to describe it at this point. I'm guessing that this is not the first or the only talk that you might have heard about Mauna Loa's eruptive history. I brought along and put on the corner of the table there, we call this a fact sheet, and I didn't make up the name, but it's become a rather popular publication series by the Geological Survey, and this was put together by my colleague Frank Truesdell, who is our current expert on Mauna Loa volcano. His project is to characterize the eruptive history of Mauna Loa and also render that into data formats and data structures that allow him to advance forecasts of how lava flows might actually impact the surrounding communities to the mountain. So it's on the table there. Frank did come out to give a talk in January. I think it was. We had this Volcano Awareness Month series of talks that a number of us participated in. So that's, oh, no, wait a minute, okay, I'm supposed to use this thing. Right.
The smoke got out.
I need to turn it on. No, it's on.
Got a lot of electrical engineers in the house.
Yeah, but where's a 12-year-old? We really need
That's what you
Who can fix it?
That's
where you want?
Yeah, right.
There you go, it should work now. Because I touched it.
Wait, touch me.
All right. We just stopped that.
Yeah, right there.
Conversation's right there.
I'm not off the hook
We weren't
yet.
talking about you.
Anyway, this is the cover of the fact sheet here, and then this is probably a familiar picture here. It was taken in during the 1984 eruption of Mauna Loa from the Hilo that advanced toward the Hilo side. So this is looking back up slope across Hilo Bay to see the advancing lava flow. And so this is, in one sense, this is maybe not necessarily how we would always want to watch Mauna Loa, but this is one of the, I think we'd have to view this as an eventuality of understanding that it does continue to be an active volcano. So this is, like I said, this is where we expect to be at some point. Frankly, please hold my
I'll
call.
silence.
It's not going to be Mauna Loa that's going to look like this, but should this be a view of a different volcano going in a different direction, then oh boy, that would ratchet up our interest quite a bit as well. Certainly yours too. Anyway, enough of that here. Again, like I said, because of my formatting is a little off here. Sorry about that. But it, like I said, as a seismologist, this is the view that I take in it, seismological perspectives, and of course, without it's still very, very much an observational enterprise, and the story here begins in 1912. That was the year that I think most of us associate with when the Volcano Observatory was established at the edge of Kilauea, and then I also think it's not just a seismologist, but it would be other people who would almost possibly universally agree that really, it really started when the first seismographs were actually set up and began operation after they were purchased and brought over by Professor Jagger, who actually established the Volcano Observatory. So in terms of, like I said, it's fundamentally an observation. There's a lot of theory involved, but I think it really doesn't go anywhere without the observations. But with a 100-year observational record here in Hawaii, I think that represents one of the very longest of the windows of observation that exists in the world seismologically. There would be places, not coincidentally, it would be places like Italy, places like Japan, and also Hawaii, where there's a long record of trying to observe volcanoes in different ways, including seismologically, of course, because of the well understood relationship or the association of volcanoes and earthquakes and seismic processes like volcanic tremors. So key to our understanding would be seismological observations. Okay, good. Don't know how many folks have been to the national. Well, I'm presuming everybody might have been to the national park. Don't know if folks have taken advantage of an opportunity every second Tuesday called A Walk into the Past. But these pictures, the picture here shows this is a current view of the area behind the Volcano House Hotel, which is this section here. And then there's this very conspicuous mound and monument. But you sneak around this rock wall, and then there's a door that leads into this facility here. And this is called the Whitney. This was originally called the Whitney Laboratory of Seismology because the Whitney Foundation, through a grant to MIT, where Jagger was professor, provided the funds for starting the observational program at Kilauea. And this is a picture of Jagger. At the time, he's actually manipulating one of the records here. I'll describe that in a little bit greater detail later on too. But here's Jagger working in the vault with one of the seismic records. These are the original seismographs that were purchased from Japan. I describe them as man-sized instruments, and everybody possibly is way ahead of me on this one, but you achieve the sensitivity of the instrument. In those days, you achieved that by just having a massive inertial mass that was somewhat delicately balanced, and so then the very subtle ground motions would be it would be capable of registering the very subtle ground motions just simply because of the relative somewhat metastable, or I guess you could refer to it as a metastable configuration. So like I said, it required, like I said, at that time that we had these man-sized instruments, and I'll be one of the first to say thank goodness for technology, because we don't have to work with those things anymore.
Was that basically a pendulum?
They are pendulum, right? Just to jump a little bit ahead, the whole theory, the whole field is based on the linear harmonic oscillator with damping, right? So it's a very well understood set of equations, very well understood mechanical system. But now with electronics and feedback circuitry, there's some, I think, pretty amazing things that we can do with the instrumentation now. I'm also glad that we changed the dress code. like I said, so with the seismographs, this is now looking out the back, not out the back door, but this is looking from that mound across at the view that's available. And of course, the thing in the foreground that you see would be, this is Kilauea Summit Caldera, which I forget, this is maybe a picture from 2014, but it was taken after the onset of the eruption that we're continuing to monitor, and that's coming from the overlook vent in Hawaii Volcano. And so then this would be, so you could take the view that they're understand that this is what, the activity in this area here was what motivated Jagger to set up the observatory where he did at the volcano. But then off in the distance, it's not unlike the weather we had today, where through the fog you can see the outline of Mauna Loa in the background here. And
It looks like there's snow on it.
yes, that so I think it was 2014. We haven't had that kind of coverage this winter, I don't think. But and as everybody would be familiar, the reason why we know that most of the reason why we know there are earthquakes is because we record the seismic waves, right? It's we're not typically right on top of the earthquake, so we experience them directly. But in the earthquake rupture process, an energy surplus goes into a packet of energy that propagates away from the earthquake source in the form of seismic waves, and that's of course what I feed off of when I'm at work. And the point being too that you don't have to be right at ground zero in order to understand what's going on seismically. You can you can observe the thing at a distance, and a lot of our volcano monitoring practice, geological survey is based on that the fact that because you are recording the seismic waves, often the earliest indicators of volcanic unrest are would be the seismic activity relating to magma moving deeper within the earth. So again, you gain an advantage not having to be, as Frank Truesdale said, you don't have to be close enough to feel the heat. All you need to do is have a sensitive enough instrument in order to record the shaking that's produced by the seismic waves. What that means in the context of today's discussion is, well, of course they were monitoring the activity that was happening in Hawaii Volcano, but also, it allowed, if the earthquakes were big enough, it allowed them to actually observe the activity beneath Mauna Loa. And so then, it's like I said, because it's based on the propagating energy that it's recorded by the seismograph. And in fact, I guess it's not exactly true that the first reports of the earliest volcano observatory reports, of course, were based on careful description of the observations relating to Hawaii Mauna and Kilauea. But the first eruption that was actually the first eruptive cycle that was actually recorded was from Mauna Loa and not Kilauea. I find that to be kind of an interesting piece of irony, where a couple of years after they set up the instruments in the vault, 1914, they began to record a sequence of events that began to their ability to observe began in the summer of 1914. You can read. I hope you can read the slide from where you're sitting, but so I'm not going to go through it in detail here. I guess the formatting is okay. But they started to record. Well, there was one station on the island, one set of instruments on the island here at the Volcano Observatory. You can't do a lot of detailed work with only a single observing point. But one thing you can do, if you are able to, is you can measure the seismic waves, elastic waves. There are two principal types of waves that propagate from an elastodynamic source. They are called P waves, and this is all new. This is not new stuff to anybody in the room here. They're called P waves and they're called S waves. The initial terminology developed because the P wave, P stands for primary. The P wave would be the first wave that the seismographs back in the day, that would be the first ones they would see coming from the earthquake source. Shortly after that, or depending on how far away from the earthquake you are, there would be another disturbance registered on the seismographs that they called the S wave or the secondary wave. And so then, if you're appropriately situated and with a sensitive enough instrument to be able to see the first shaking and the second shaking, you can measure the time difference between the two wave arrivals. And then you do the simple algebra in terms of rate times time equals distance inverted. So based on the separation of the wave arrivals, they could estimate how far they could possibly estimate how far the candidate earthquake source was away from your instrument in order to determine a plausible location for the earthquake. I think I said that right. It's like, you know, I'm trying out conditioning it because you're not directly observing the earthquake. We're always making inferences because we're not down in the earth to make the observation. We're making these measurements at the surface, and we're trying to understand things that are happening deep within the earth. So, no, it didn't change. Confused by this layer. So it's like I said, if it doesn't, if it looks like an earthquake, if your measurements, I'm trying to paraphrase, you know, if it looks like it smells, it has to fit a certain framework. The observations have to fit into a certain framework before you can actually feel confident that it's an earthquake. It's like we really, and certainly in the older, you really don't know that it's an earthquake except for how the waves behave. So that's, maybe that's a little too weird to try to put out in a public talk here, but I think you could probably catch on to what I'm trying to get at here. So based on the time differences they measured on the seismographs that were measured on the instruments here at HBO, the first occurrence in this series of events, they said, oh, well, we have maybe a magnitude 5 earthquake that was located, based on the time differences on the seismogram, about between 12 and 20 miles away from the Volcano Observatory. And I've drawn these two circles. The inner circle radius is 20 miles. The outer circle radius is 25 miles. So then, okay, and then this all happened also before a magnitude scale for earthquakes was at 1914. The Richter scale was developed in the mid-1930s, and so then, it's only looking back at the description of the effects of the earthquake that we think it might have been a magnitude 5 earthquake. So it was and your experience here would be would allow you to understand that it was a pretty significant ground shaking that was sustained during that event there. But after the July sequence of activity, again, like I said, 12 to 20 miles from the Volcano Observatory, so placed it in this area here, which we now understand to be the very active fault system between the two volcanic summits that we call the Kauiki fault system. Back in those days, of course, they were just beginning, so they didn't have the body of observation to build up that kind of an interpretation. And also because of the single inch, all they could do was determine the distance. So it would just be the best case they could make was, well, we know that the earthquake would be somewhere on these radius, at this radius from the volcano. But then it would be a whole additional consideration to say, oh, well, so the earthquake would be, where would the earthquake be? It'd have to be somewhere on that radius, but it would take additional information to actually place it a little more precisely in position. Like I said, maybe I've already jumped into too much esoteric detail. But then shortly after the earthquakes, they decided to repair and renovate the instrument vault, so they went offline for a good number of months. But later, in the early fall, another large earthquake sequence was experienced. And again, based on the measurements that they had available, they said, oh, it's about 20 miles away from the volcano. And then Jagger told his guys, well, you better get the instrument back up to operation here so we could record what's going on. What took place is, as you can read here, after the earthquake sequence in September, earthquake activity continued, and it continued, and it continued. And and then on this is a Windows Macintosh difference, and I produced the slides on my Macintosh. Anyway, in the fall of 1914, late November, there was a swarm of earthquakes. It was a very, very noticeable swarm of earthquakes that occurred. And rather than being sort of within this 20-mile circle there, it was the time differences that they measured suggested it was a little bit farther away from HBO. And then later in the afternoon of that, they received reports of a plume from people working down in this area, the Kapapala Ranch, Kalu district. So ranch hands and folks in the lower elevation said, "Oh wow, there's a cloud coming from the top of the mountain." maybe the volcano's erupting. So like I said, this was all of the, while Kilauea was doing its lava lake thing in Hawaii, 1912, 1914, this sequence was also part of the observation set because of the ability to measure the seismic activity at Mauna Loa. So just to cut to the chase here, I should show you this. So this is an example. This is the record of the day, or the seismogram from the day of the eruption. And in the early days, the first instruments, the recording medium was a glossy textured paper that was coated with kerosene soot. So they'd light a kerosene lamp, and I actually, I'm old enough to have had to do this myself too. But so they'd run the glossy paper over the kerosene lamp, and they would try to achieve a relatively uniform coating of soot on the record. And then that was the thing that Jagger was manipulating like this. And then when it was mounted on the instrument, they would lower a very, very sharp stylus or a needle onto the paper surface, and then there'd be a mechanism, gearing mechanism, motor drive that would move the drum underneath the stylus. And when things were not happening so rigorously, there'd be a relatively straight line etched into the soot. And then when you'd have an earthquake, you'd get these, the stylus would scratch the earthquake trace or the seismic trace onto the surface of the smoky drum. And these don't, there's not a strong resemblance to the records that we record now digitally, but you can see, every time there's a little bit of a furry piece of trace here, these are the little earthquakes that they were looking at to try to understand what was going on seismologically or seismically on the island of Hawaii. So then, like I said, there's this opportunity every second Tuesday to go into the Whitney vault to see some reconstruction of the apparatuses that Jagger had set up to do this recording. So this is another presentation of that sequence of events here. I do think I hope it's possible to see. So now, nothing fancy here, but we just simply lay out the number of earthquakes counted per day by the folks who were looking at the record, beginning at the beginning of 1914 and running through the year here. And each of the, like I said, so each stick represents a day, and then the height of the stick represents the number of earthquakes that they counted in that day. This is the magnitude 5 sequence in July that was registered or recorded. And then, like I said, shortly after the instrument, the vault went into repair. But then after the second magnitude 5 earthquake in late September, they got the instrument back into operation, and they recorded still elevated numbers of earthquakes. And I think I think you can also see that, since after this sequence here, the activity remained at a relatively high level, leading into late November when there was this earthquake swarm that registered 14 earthquakes per day, and then with the associated observation of the plume rising that was visible from the lower elevations in the southeast flank of Mauna Loa, and that was all summarized in this report. They were able to put the observations together and produced a manuscript that was published by the Seismological Society of America Bulletin the following year. And it's the intervening text was here's the bottom line here of the discussion here is the writer, a fellow named Harry Wood, is very, very confident that what they were recording on the seismographs was the prelude, the seismic prelude, the seismic precursors to the eruption of Mauna Loa. And so, like I said, this would be, rather than on Kilauea, it's on Mauna Loa, where the first cycle of behavior, or first process of leading to an eruption was actually recorded instrumentally. Anecdotally here, this is interesting too. I mentioned that the earthquake magnitude scale postdates this eruption by quite a number of years. But when Richter did his work in Southern California, by the time that was going on, this Dr. Wood moved from Hawaii to Southern California to work with the people at Caltech and the seismological laboratory at Caltech. And he was one of the scientists that built the instrument that Richter used to base the Richter magnitude scale on. Like I said, I think the evolution of the observation and the interpretation of things, it's always something I find really quite interesting. But you needed to have a standard instrument, a calibrated instrument deployed somewhat deliberately to be able to begin to make quantitative studies and compare sizes of earthquakes, for example, to try to advance some of the understanding. Okay, so like I said, so here these at the time, 1914, there was only the single installation at Kilauea, at the summit called Kilauea. These different maps show the rather slow growth through the early first half of the 20th century of the seismic monitoring program. So each of the darkened triangles indicates places where we've had where instruments were operated. You could understand that you couldn't just put out an instrument in any old place based on that first picture of Jagger. Because of the attention that was required to operate the instruments, they needed to be located in places where you could have somebody available to service the instrument. So they tended to be in populated areas on the island. Well, you can see the distribution here. And so then each of those locations had these collections of smoke drums that would record the activity, and they would need to be changed and serviced every day. And then the records would have to be sent to the volcano for the staff to look at there. So through the first half of the 20th century, there was relatively slow growth. These were still the systems that were just completely mechanical in nature. So, like I said, it required the size, it required the daily attention. Even the small paper record was an integral part of the design to achieve the calibration attributes of the recording system. That all changed in the early 1950s. I single out this former colleague of mine, geological survey colleague of mine, Jerry Eaton, who came to Hawaii right after he graduated from Cal, and he wrote his PhD dissertation on the theory of the electromechanical seismograph. And it was not Jagger, it was Professor McDonald who hired Eaton to come out and begin to modernize the seismic network on the island and at the volcano. And so then, as Jerry began to do his work, they were able to begin to expand the network to different locations. Also, Jerry did some rather profound analysis to understand the physical characteristics of the pendulum systems and the recording systems that were required in order to optimally record the earthquakes that they were interested in Hawaii, so that they didn't have to just get whatever was off on somebody's shelf or what some other guy was making. He actually undertook the instrumentation design and fabrication procedures of the volcanoes recording, to the point where they and then also Jerry also developed a recording system to allow you to get the instruments and out into the remote locations, but then record them centrally at the Volcano Observatory. So in 1958, they began to string out miles and miles of cable to connect the stations, I guess as far out as the desert and Mauna Loa Strip Road, to transmit the signals back to the recorders here. And then they began to string out more and more cable in the early 1970s to get out into the rift zones and again into some of the more remote parts of the island. And then also in the late 1960s and in this time period here, they began to exploit radio technology, radio telemetry, using analog FM lines to transmit the signals over the distances instead of having to just simply string out cable and lay it on the ground. So this would describe this sort of the beginning of the modern field network that would be somewhat incomplete if there also were not a way to more efficiently record the data coming from these sites in a much more manageable and lasting way. And these are just to show different views. The piece of a relatively important piece of equipment is called the develocorder. And what it was a half-inch microfilm recording medium. And so the film magazine would be up in this part of the unit here. This is the actual recording unit. But so the microfilm, and they pass it through the galvanometers in the system as well. But then they pass the film underneath the light sources that were attached to the galvanometers. And then in this part of the unit here, it would go through a quick developing bath so that they would fix it was an 18-minute interval from exposure to fixed record. But within 18 minutes, there'd be a record that would be viewable on this lower part of the thing here, which is simply just the screen to turn on to make sure that the instrument is working at any given moment. And then so they pass a magazine of film large enough to fit a day on it. Take the film out of the record and put it on a viewing screen. So you can. This is I'll just say that they put on a viewing screen so you have a ×20 magnification of the seismic traces that are coming across the screen here. You can see the analyst. This is back in the day, so we're doing the work with pencils and rulers, and we're writing the observations down on tablets. But what they're doing is they're scanning the daily record, trying to achieve number one, simply a count of earthquakes per day or per unit time. And then if an earthquake is large enough, here you see one of the analysts with her ruler. And what she is doing is she's measuring the times, the times where the primary and the secondary waves of the earthquakes arrive at these individual stations. And then what this device allowed was, of course, you could select each of these lines across the page represents the signal from an individual site. And then with appropriate organizing of the appropriate lining of the deck chairs in the recording system here, they basically grouped stations by geographic region in different parts of the film record. And so by almost a visual scan, you can have a look at this and say, oh, there's an earthquake on Mauna Loa, there's an earthquake in the Kauai fault zone, there's an earthquake in Hawaii, so then this provided for the time, a relatively rapid way to get a visual assessment of where the seismic activity is here. It is occurring on the record there. And so then, like I said, each one of these spools would contain a day's worth of data. And like I said, the ability to regionalize based on the arrangement of the data on the screen allowed the ability to classify the locations of where the activity was taking place. One of them, so one of the I'm here to talk about how we watched Mauna Loa. So based on these film scans, based on this enterprise here, where they just visually scan the record and make the measurements, what they did was they compiled earthquake counts, and so then this is just simply the number of earthquakes per day, beginning this is a little bit not quite it's maybe a year and a half or so. So beginning in April 1st of 1974. So with the develocorder scan beginning in early 1974, they were able to detect an increase in activity here, so each day would be one of the points there. And actually, the early onset in April, they did have occasion to exceed 100 earthquakes per day. And so they go, okay, well, at the time they just registered the count, but they didn't necessarily think about it that much. But then they get a little bit farther into the summer and they say, well, no, here's, the increase occurred again, and then it persisted through here. And as you can see, I've labeled this gray line here as 100 events per day. That's actually a pretty, even in an active area, that's quite a large number of earthquakes. But then as the story goes, as the record goes, that persisted for many, many days here. And then in December of 1974, there was a very, very large registration of earthquake activity, again, localized beneath Mauna Loa summit, where in first half of December, I think this is like December 15th, there was a registered, not 100 earthquakes per day, but there was an earthquake a minute. There's 1,440 minutes in a day, so there's nearly 1,500 earthquakes on a given day there. And then that sequence of activity actually kind of shut down pretty quickly, but there was a magnitude, this asterisk here marks a magnitude 4.5 earthquake that was located on the right beneath the rim of Mauna Loa summit caldera on the west-northwest side. Again, like I said, after that initial that series, the magnitude 4.6 the activity dropped down, but then later into that year, later into the cycle, the increase registered again, and then the accounts went up to hundreds and hundreds of earthquakes per day, and that level of activity persisted. There's another magnitude 4 earthquake. This was on the opposite side of the summit caldera. We had the advantage of being able to locate these earthquakes a little more precisely at the time. But then so it's like, well, something is definitely up. And so then, and then they just continued to actually, when they started to see this increase here, they went back and made sure and rescanned the record to make sure they didn't overlook something. And so this is reflective of the initial analysis and then the reanalysis. But like I said, so there's a rather clear increase in activity that started April 1974 and continued for over a year until the eruption in early July 1975 took place here. And so again, like the experience with Wood's experience with the 1914 eruption, the staff at the time, I was not lucky enough to be here at the time, but the staff prepared a manuscript, they did the data analysis, they prepared a manuscript and submitted it to a journal, but unfortunately, everything was hand prepared. They plotted the data by hand, they typed up the manuscript, and actually the camera-ready copy manually on a typewriter. And so in that whole publication process, the eruption actually took place. But the publishers of the journal were kind enough to allow addition of the statement that, they actually submitted the manuscript before the eruption took place. So the folks that did a really nice job of forecasting the eruption. It was the publication cycle that prevented it being a forecast. It was more of a hindsight thing. I don't know if I don't know what to think about the nonstop, the 24-hour cycle that we live in now. But so anyway, like I said, a case where there was a documented forecast of the eruption. One of the ways that we look at it too is these are simply the earthquake counts. I think a lot of these are typically too small to actually allow an instrumental location or a precise location to be computed. But this is how the activity looked in terms of with the view toward earthquakes that are large enough to locate and to compute relatively precise earthquake hypocenters and epicenters and allow plotting on a map base. So interestingly, prior to both the 1975 eruption and the 1984 eruption, we have these distributions of earthquakes. And here's the outline of Mauna Loa summit called their Moku'aleogo crater. And there were rather recognizable concentrations of earthquakes. They're coded by color according to depth. So this color, which I think is green, reflects very shallow earthquakes. This color reflects earthquakes between 5 kilometers and 13 kilometers below the surface. But like I said, there are these two rather conspicuous concentrations of earthquake activity that were registered prior to both of the most recent eruptions in Mauna Loa. There are differences in the details of the distribution, but the observation, I think, was so captivating that we began to embrace this as one of the frameworks that we would use to forecast the earthquake, to forecast possible subsequent eruptive behaviors on Mauna Loa. And then another way we present that is to just plot out the earthquakes. Now these are the numbers of the located earthquakes from those previous maps, and just plot them out. This is this is now a timeline from the early 1970s through both of the most recent eruption, 1975, 1984. And you can see here that there's very clear increases in activity in both of these depth ranges, the shallow earthquakes and the deeper earthquakes. And then, so like I said, very, very clear increases in earthquake activity prior to the eruption that is indicated by the blue bar that I've drawn in here. After the 1975 eruption, the volcano goes back into repose. It's not. I think we've been arguing about this. No, we don't argue at work. We simply discuss things. But we've been trying to wonder, really how to best understand the post 1975 behaviors. There's very clearly an increase in earthquake activity that begins possibly as early as late 1976 in the shallow activity. But it doesn't. It kind of doesn't really do a whole lot. There's the earthquake activity in the deeper depth range is kind of showing this as well. One of the ways that I try to voice it is, what's the background state of an active volcano, right? I mean, an active volcano probably should have earthquakes that occur, and so then a cumulative plot of earthquakes in an active volcano will always tend to show an increasing trend.
I'm sorry, the red line is the number of earthquakes per day or per week?
It is the number of earthquakes per day. Did I get that?
It says per week on the left. But what are the black bars? What are the black bars then?
The black bars are the raw numbers. So the red line is the cumulative number,
Oh,
and the black lines are the daily. Sorry, you got it right. The weekly tally that was.
but it's cumulative from day one.
The red line is cumulative. Yes.
So it's not like 1980 wasn't 300 a day. That's cumulative number of earthquakes since.
Yeah. This presentation is which maybe sometimes we try to show too much, but you got it.
Okay, so it's not getting worse.
Well, I mean we could talk about the terminology, right?
Yeah.
Like I said, what's the background state of an active volcano, right? It's going to show activity, so the numbers are always going to increase. But then when I think you could possibly agree that something like this that happened in this is the pre-1975 buildup, April '74. Something like this is rather clear, right? So when it departs from what might be arguably a background rate, say, okay, well, this is now something that we have to pay a little bit more attention to. Where you would begin to show that concern after the 1975 eruption and before the 1984, that's a little harder to say, right? You could almost make the argument that the 1975 eruption really began the build-up to the 1984 eruption, but then if you want to talk like that, then that's, we're not going to make much scientific progress if we take that. That's extremely simplistic. We know that. So we needed to understand how to put these observations into the current context. So then, just to summarize a little bit here, this was the longest 1950, which was the eruption upper southwest rift of Mauna Loa. 1975 was up at the summit caldera. Prior to now, this was the longest intereruptive period that the volcano was observed to exhibit. And then, so one of the thoughts was in the first half of the 20th century, the experience was there'd be eruptions that happen on a 3 to 5 year cycle. And so then one of the thoughts was, okay, after 1975, we're going to go back to a much more frequent occurrence of eruptive activity. And that's what began to, that was one of the things that motivated the staff to say, well, let's look a little more closely at how the earthquake behaviors are beginning to increase. And in 1977, they began to issue forecasts of when the next eruption after 1975 would take place. I transferred from California in the late 1980s. If some of you folks were around and might remember in the early 1990s, we began to speculate and speculate somewhat publicly that we might be looking at things that would suggest we're going to have the next eruption of Mauna Loa. After a number of years where we continued to make these observations of the background activity, we backed off of issuing forecast-like statements. That just kind of demonstrates that we really need to learn more about volcanoes. But then in terms of how these things fit into the framework, like I said, 9 years between eruptions was a little bit long relative to the pre-1950 activity. But now, look, we've been almost 32 years since the 1984 eruption. So now, do we want to continue to speak in these terms? I guess might be the best question to ask. I referred to the early 1990s. Part of that discussion was motivated by recording more and more earthquakes. They didn't necessarily localize into the patterns that I showed pre-1975, 1984. But in addition to the earthquake activity, we do also conduct geodetic monitoring of volcanoes. And out of the entire collection of geodetic observations, I'll just focus on a single one that we kind of use as a conceptual crutch to lean on. But back in the day with surveying techniques, precise surveying techniques, we would just routinely go up and measure the distance across the summit caldera between these 2 points here. This blue line here shows the distance, the line length between these two positions on the mountain. We do record the eruptive activity, but the observation that we were keying off of was, after we go through this 1984 eruption, there's a little bit of recovery, but then these two points continue to separate into the 1990s, and then we were trying to base some inference on just the amount of line length, to paraphrase it or to simplify, just the amount of line length increase as a function of time since the 1984 eruption. So, like I said, the language was, we've recovered X amount of the inflation beneath Mauna Loa that occurred. We recovered X amount of the deformation or X amount of the displacement that were recorded in 1984 in this time, 1980, 1990, 1995. And like I said, as the active volcano continued to stretch, these points continued to move apart. So it's like, okay, well, it continued to stretch, continued to show signs of activity. And like I said, at the time, we thought there might be some basis to issue forecasts of not imminent, but anticipated eruptions within a 3 to 5 year time frame. And thankfully,
So the vertical scale is change in line length, right? Not the actual line length.
no, it is the change in line length, right.
So say it was 1,000 meters, initially it's then 1,001, something like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. So now this brings us to where we are. We didn't have an eruption in the 1990s. We haven't had an eruption since 1984 now. So now, like I said, I should have updated this slide because it's now 2016. But over 30 years of repose, the longest inter-eruptive interval, and growing. Our thinking is influenced by our thinking would focus on looking for precursory earthquake activity, patterns of earthquake activity, occur, the same source locations lighting up with earthquakes that activated in 1974 and 1983, and then some ability to measure the stretching of the Earth's surface, geodetically monitored changes, and just again providing some clues that the volcano is deforming and building up toward the next eruption here. And and then, like I said, the framework is that maybe we'll have many months, maybe a year, maybe several years of this kind of behavior taking place that would really reflect building up to a subsequent eruption of the volcano. We've improved our ability to observe by densifying the instrumental coverage of the volcano. This just shows all of the seismic stations on the island. They're color-coded according to some characteristics of the instrument systems that we have in place. But not only is it the additional stations that we have on the island, distributions like this allow us to really very precisely estimate the locations of especially shallow earthquakes that we think would be related to eruptions. But then it's also the introduction of automated and real-time processing that we depend on now. Instead of making a data analyst pull the data off of a viewing screen, we run computer algorithms to try to detect candidate or plausible earthquakes. And if we do detect things that look like they might be earthquakes, we subject them to some automated processing to see if we could pull out an earthquake location that makes any sense. And so then, like I said, rather than fishing for data, we're just continually bailing data out of the servers. And so overall, that achieves an incredible increase in network sensitivity and also what I would call cataloging sensitivity, our ability to track the earthquake activity somewhat precisely. The seismic network is complemented by a bunch of other instrumentation that has been placed in the field here. The seismic stations are included in these symbols here. But so there's the whole suite of instruments, from GPS instruments, tilt meters that simply register changes in the orientation of basically a bubble within a level based on where the site is relative to the possible place where magma is accumulating. We measure strain. We have strain meters that will measure the response of stresses within the earth at these different locations. Measure the gas emissions from the volcano, now the famous and indispensable webcams, as well as a set of low-frequency acoustic instruments, similar to the ones that Milton Garces runs out of his office down the road a little bit. And then for all of these instrument streams, what we do is we subject these things to automated data processing, and it just affords an incredibly increased capability and measure things that are happening. So what's been going on since the when we quit trying to forecast eruptions based on these line length here, the deformation, the stretching of the summit of the volcano has continued. It doesn't occur monotonically or simply, it goes through cycles of behaviors here. I think we probably don't have a terribly good understanding of, is this magma disappearing from within the volcano? Probably not. There are many things that would influence the separation of these points, not the least of which would be earthquake activity as well. So so there's a lot of while there's a lot of detail, I think it's also safe to say we need to understand the detail a little bit more effectively. But then in the early 2000s, we began to again register a rather obvious increase in the separation of these 2 points across the crater, which then subsequently leveled off. With our increased ability to monitor, process earthquake data, we had a rather intense, rather interesting swarm of earthquakes, not shallow earthquakes beneath the candidate or the suspect areas on the upper flanks of the volcano here, but if you look at this part of the figure here, there were so many earthquakes that the epicenters obliterate any ability to see the outline of the summit caldera, but these were located 40-50 kilometers below the surface of the earth, so they were really, really deep earthquakes. Interestingly, this swarm of earthquakes did occur in somewhat of a time association with that increase that I showed, this increase here, which was modeled as reflecting accumulation of magma in a magma chamber, and also accumulating of magma within something that we would interpret as a dike, a magmatic dike. Although the seismic activity was way deeper than anything that, it was, to me, it was so deep that it really would be impossible to establish an association between the deep earthquakes here and the shallow deformations here. But the combination of these observations motivated us to increase our alert level or our awareness of activity there. But again, this is 2004, and guess what? Nothing has happened since. So these are, like I said, what is the background state of an active volcano? This is where we are now, where if I run it, these are 3. Did I screw this? Yeah, I did. This is a 3-year plot. It's 2013, not February 2011. 2013 to 2016. This is the line length between the two points here, and then these are the earthquakes, similarly plotted with the daily earthquakes individually, and then the cumulative number in this red line here. So again, like I said, we're looking at an active volcano. There is showing a very clear increase in the distance separating these 2 points here, and to some way of looking at the graphics, that the increase in the distance does seem to generally associate with increases in the numbers of earthquakes that occur per day in the summit caldera region of Mauna Loa. What's also, I think, pretty evident and pretty important to recognize is that this is anything but a uniform rate of activity here. You can see in the later part of last year, or middle of last year and subsequent, the stretching of this area stopped, and it's rolled over, and it's kind of flattened out. I'm not going to show. There's maybe a little bit too detailed here, but we think that instead, so across this area here, the ground deformation or the stretching has kind of leveled off, but instead now we're beginning to measure increased separation across this part of the southwest rift zone. So like I said, it's a rather active system. There's some, maybe there'd be an ability to say that magma is moving within the storage complex up at the top of the volcano. But at the same time, the earthquake rates are just kind of fluctuating here, and this certainly caught our eye in the later part, in the second half, in the summer of 2015. But then since, in the last month or so, the rate has actually leveled off. So again, we're just simply watching the turns and the twists and the shifts that are taking place within the volcano. Where they are in map view. Now this is interesting because what we're seeing is this is the last 3 years of activity. We're seeing concentrations of earthquake activity in the same areas that lit up before the two most recent eruptions of 84 and 75. But they're as indicated in this graphic here. So they're occurring at 10 earthquakes a day. They haven't. On occasion, they've reached 40, 50 earthquakes a day, but like I said, the average might be well, I don't know. You place the line to fit the average where you would think, but we're orders of magnitude lower in activity compared to the pre-1975 buildup, where we would have hundreds of earthquakes per day leading into the eruption in 1975. So we're quite a ways backed off from levels of activity where we think we're looking at pre-eruptive seismicity. Interesting though that, and this is probably a property of earthquakes, is earthquakes tend to occur in the same locations in the same system. So now we're getting a very different view because we're not fishing for them anymore. We're getting spoon-fed by the computer systems. And then now, instead of simply counting the earthquakes beneath the summit caldera, we can actually get locations of these things, and the locations of them really help with building up not only some of the interpretation, but also doing some more ambitious data analysis, so we can make some more higher precision or add detail to our interpretive discussions. So don't worry, I'm coming to the end here. I've been staying up here for a long time. Where we are is that we're still looking at an active volcano. We're looking at the geodetic monitors. So we're looking at possibly magma spreading within parts of the storage complex, and we're looking at elevated levels of earthquake activity, but they are still relatively low levels. And so like I said, we would look to a much more obvious increase in activity before we start to issue really statements of real forecasts of what might be going on. We do continue to maintain a watchful eye on the volcano, and like I said, previous experience would suggest that we would see some rather suggestive changes in behavior that would allow us to say, okay, well, maybe we're going to get into a different part of the eruptive cycle. And so this is how we're watching Mauna Loa. And now with the wonders of the internet and automated processing, you know, everybody is now able to tune into this and, you know, kind of keep an eye along with us in terms of what we're all concerned about. So anyway, that's my note.
Is there anything, thank you. Is there anything that could cause the spreading other than inflation? Like maybe it's not really magma moving at all, maybe it's just sagging, or is there anything possibility?
Well, you know, a big source of ground deformation would be faulting, and like what we're seeing on Kilauea, and I guess it was in the newspaper last, you know, these slow earthquakes. No, is that? You know, we've talked about these slow earthquakes beneath Kilauea. Well, part of the faulting cycle is not only earthquakes, but it's also rather slow deformations. And so, you know, there's that whole range of elastic brittle behaviors that, you know, could be invoked, you know, but we need to then have a little bit more detail, a little bit more resolution in terms of where we think these things are happening before we'd say, oh, well, it's not magma, you know, it's this instead. Gotta admit that beneath the summit caldera of a volcano or beneath the roof zone of a volcano, suggesting magma is not a horrible idea, but I'll be the first guy to say that, you know, not everything has to be magmatic. Not everything in geophysics here has to be magmatic in origin. So,
Do you have any other proof other than the spreading that it's swelling? Is it coming up and raising up?
none of the other monitors aren't showing that. Like, you know, we have the earthquakes, but that just shows you that the earthquakes just show you where the stresses are at the appropriate level where you can generate earthquakes. You know, that's kind of an indirect thing. Where we have gas monitors up there, we have webcams, right? We're not seeing increased emissions. We're not measuring increased emissions. You know, so that again kind of keeps us thinking, well, we're kind of some ways away from interruption. You know, the magma is not shallow enough yet to allow these other measurables to manifest themselves in the data streams.
I guess I'm getting at maybe the distance between those 2 points is not necessarily predictive.
Well, I think it's indicative, but not necessarily predictive, right? It's indicative, yeah. I think that's a fair statement.
What's the status of Mauna Loa at this point? I know from previous conversations with other so there many years ago were telling me that Mauna Loa was actually overdue from a cyclic standpoint, and that it was a different form of volcano than Mauna Loa.
It's in a different stage of its life cycle, right. We're not, we're not seeing suggestive seismicity, and we're not seeing suggestive geodetic changes. The team was out last week. They were going up and down the side of the island with GPS instruments. And so we're not seeing those indicators for below the line. Again, I think, like I said, we kind of expect that we will, but you know,
Just don't know.
we don't know. Right?
Could you speak kind of in general terms and briefly, what's the variation of the resistivity or conductivity of rock, like basalt, with the variation in temperature?
Oh, I'd have to go look that kind of stuff up.
Well, there are surveys. They have a person's name. They're called Schlumberger arrays, where you can measure the resistivity or conductivity, which does vary with temperature. I used to work in geothermal exploration, and that can be automated. And it just occurs to me that if you heat up a rock on a hot plate, it's going to expand. And if you let it sit in the earth for 10 years and cool off, it's going to contract. You know.
And those changes in state will give you the ability to measure different electrical properties.
Yes.
Right. That's not something that was being more actively pursued in the 1980s. But we haven't been conducting those kinds of geophysical measurements terribly routinely, more recently. So I think nothing like a 1980, a 33-year-old eruption to captivate your field guys' interests, and so they're all over the East Rift Zone and trying to measure stuff there. But no, like I said, prior to the onset of the Okubo eruption, they were doing a lot more systematic conductivity and resistivity measurements. But more recently, that really hasn't been part of a big part of the working set. It's as you say, the physical principles are undeniable, but then conducting the measurement, or doing the measurements and then building that up over to develop baselines and things, we haven't been doing that. Like I said, I guess I would blame Pu'ulo'o and now Hawaii for taking our interest in other directions. I don't know if any electro measurements are planned for Mauna Loa. It's other things that we're trying to do are measure some of the get a map of the gravity field at the surface, so we could look for changes, suggested concentrations of density to be suggestive of that. But like I said, the electrical measurements really haven't been pursued so much.
Yeah, further to his question about the change in distance across the summit, what have the tilt meters shown, and have they been coupled with the change in distance?
The tilt meters they're good over they principally show the diurnals at this point, because the ground tilt changes are still pretty small. Maybe the source is a little too deep to register in terms of that ground tilt. What they're pulling out of the GPS network is height changes. So there are times suggestions that the surface of the volcano has lifted, consistent with inflation. So you piece together these different observations. So, well, what's a plausible explanation for that? So, like I said, the GPS elevations are increasing at time, and then they'll also flatten out and and fluctuate. But there's not yet a really, except for the horizontal displacements across different parts of the summit and upper rift zone. I think they're beginning to establish a coherent signal, but it hasn't. It really hasn't shown up so much in the tilt meter observations per se. But like I said, when it all starts to really ramp up, like I said, our understanding is all of these measurements are going to come into play, and a lot of the measurement techniques are really tuned into seeing things happen at the shallowest of levels. So, and because we don't see the coherent patterns, except for a couple of these examples, again, that tells us we're probably not at that point. But like I said, I wouldn't. Whenever, I guess maybe one way to try to say this is when it starts to happen. I think we'll all start to see it if we go to web pages and things like that. There are going to be some pretty clear changes, pretty significant changes, or departures from the baselines that are established through time. So, ladies first.
Was there a discernible increase in earthquake activity before the explosion at Hawaii?
No. In hindsight, we think, in hindsight, we think that we saw a noticeable increase in background volcanic tremor levels, but it wasn't anything that caught our eye at the time. And then also the gas geochemists were noting increased levels of sulfur dioxide, but these weren't large enough. They weren't occurring in large enough bunches, for a great technical term, until maybe getting closer to March 2008 when the explosion actually took place. But seismically, it was amazingly quiet. I think because, first of all, the the volcano was already erupting and there was stuff happening already. And sure, I sure would not have wanted to be in the way of the March 2008 explosion, but it really wasn't that big an event. So then, you've got a massively cracked system in the summit caldera region. Well, volcanoes are intrinsically cracked. So it would take a big change in order to register these things in some of these different geophysical manifestations. So no, like I said, in hindsight, we said, oh, maybe there was a little bit of an increase in trend. It certainly wasn't anything that caught our eye until the thing exploded. So that didn't help us that much.
Is there work underway to develop a structural model of the volcano?
I'd like to think so. One of the things that we can get out of when we measure the times and we locate the earthquakes, one of the things that allows you to do computationally is to what we call tomography.
Yes.
Yeah, and the problem with that is, we up on Mauna Loa, we probably get, we might be. I think we're happy with 2 kilometer resolution, being able to resolve things 2 kilometers on a site. We might be able to squeeze that down to maybe we can resolve details at a kilometer, but we don't have the instrumental coverage to allow us to get terribly fine scale information on what's underneath there. Our tomographic models, my tomographic models, they routinely allow us to image in a gross manner, in somewhat of I guess I should say gross. We can image the general position of the magma chamber up there beneath the summit caldera. We don't image necessarily, we're not imaging at this point strong signatures of magma storage in the rift zones. So, we're still kind of groping our way through that space.
But is this mostly passive work, or do you actively thumping the ground?
No, it's all passive. It's all based on the earthquake activity. One of the things that is very exciting, and we have in great abundance, is the Russians and other Eastern Europeans developed the methodology to use signal that we derive out of the ambient, out of microseism, the oceanic microseismic excitation, to pull out velocity information from the seismograms as well. So we've begun to apply those applications on our data streams in general. And